Today, we're going to be speaking with Eric Levitz, who writes about politics and economics for New York Magazine and wrote a very interesting piece, Blaming Capitalism Is Not an Alternative to Solving Problems. Eric, great to have you on. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I thought the piece was interesting because it's not really a defense of capitalism, but it's a pragmatic approach to sort of, I would say, the realities of the American economy, groups within that economy, political orientation, and some of the issues that are sort of facing us. Can you talk a little bit, just big picture, about the connection between the economic ideas of voters versus how they evaluate the economic ideas as presented by elected officials? For example, if a self-described free market capitalist hears about the Green New Deal, how or with what rubric, what standards voters tend to apply when they evaluate the economic proposals of candidates in this sort of context that you write about?
Sure. I mean, I think that one thing to say is that ordinary voters, who are much less politically engaged, I think, than the type of people that would watch this YouTube show or that read my articles, they have a lot of contradictory intuitions about the economy, which you can often see in certain polls where just small changes in wording can really yield really different results. So, right, polls consistently find that if you ask people, is the government spending too much on welfare, that a majority of people will say, yes, there's government spending too much on welfare. If you ask, is the government spending too much, or should the government spend more on the poor, you get a large majority of Americans saying, yes, the government should spend more on the poor. And so there's, really sort of different conflicting moral intuitions that people have. Voters tend to believe that there is, a fundamental sort of right to that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure that everybody can afford, basic goods like healthcare. They have a sense that, people are entitled to jobs, people who want to work. At the same time, there is a aversion to the idea that somebody is going to be getting government help and not contributing to the economy. There is a sense that, a very heightened sensitivity to consumer prices and a vague worries about the idea of the federal deficit and debt that conservatives can weaponize. And so there's just a lot of different inchoate intuitions that, depending on the narrative that elected officials provide and that the media amplifies, you can get the mass public to view even the same policies in different ways. And certainly there is, not a tremendous amount of coherence with people down the line agreeing with the conservative ideology on every question, nor for that matter, the progressive one.
You talk quite a bit about climate change and some of that inconsistency and some of the components within that, including public opinion about policies like carbon taxes or restricting nuclear energy or hydropower. Can you talk a little bit about the inconsistency of support in sort of the context of figuring out what the public wants done, quote, about climate change?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the context of the piece, I'm talking about sort of the necessity of reform, of fundamentally doing the sometimes inglorious work of building coalitions and getting the most that you can at any given moment, given the balance of forces in the government and in the economy, versus a sort of revolutionary vision of how you make change on climate change, which would envision blowing up pipelines, natural gas pipelines, taking direct action. And my point that I make is that I think that I'm skeptical of those strategies specifically because I think that people who proselytize for them haven't fully grappled with the state of mass opinion on climate change, which is that most people regard climate change as a problem. They believe the science. They are vaguely worried about it. At the same time, for most, working class, lower middle class people, the imperatives of making their monthly budgets work is just it's so much more salient and so much more top of mind than the sort of abstract concern of the long-term ecological problems that our economy is creating. And so if you have a situation where the imperative to tackle climate change is put into direct conflict with making energy more expensive, um, which potentially could happen if you have a bunch of terrorists, eco-terrorists, blowing up pipelines, and you have a breakdown in the sort of natural gas infrastructure of the country. That could result in a significant increase in people's energy bills, which could build public support for a government crackdown on environmentalists. So that I think is something to think about there. And I think that the virtue of a Green New Deal type strategy is that it attempts to reconcile the competing imperatives of expanding economic opportunity and a sense of felt prosperity in the present with making sure that our economy is ecologically sustainable in the long term.
There are even among the left-wing portion of my audience, there is disagreement about which approach would achieve the most change the most quickly, longer term, incrementalism, or like a sort of revolutionary, more accelerationist perspective of break it all down and rebuild it in the way we want, which I think the blowing up of pipelines that you suggest would kind of be in that latter philosophy. On incrementalism, when you talk about climate change, sometimes you say to people, well, 4% of cars now being sold are electric, and if we can get that to 8 and then 12 and then, by 2035, for a lot of people, that rings true as the right and correct way to do it, and the way that actually will get the change to happen faster in the long run. Others say, no, that's like, you're going to have to do something much more radical or drastic than that. Is there is there consensus on that? Like, how popular nationally is the accelerationist view on some of these issues versus the incremental?
I'm not sure how much the question of, do you support a ecological revolution has been polled, but I would say that generally speaking, if you look at just polling about how people describe themselves, self-identify ideologically, right? In Gallup's polling, about 75% of the country identifies as either moderate or conservative. There's a lot of ambiguity about what people mean when they say that. If you looked at 2020 primary polls, you would often see that that Bernie Sanders was second among Democrats who identified as moderate, right? So people mean different things by that, but I think that the ideological identifiers are meaningful enough that there are just not a lot of people in that supermajority who identify as either conservative or moderate who favor revolutionary violence. I think that that's just not America, for all of its myriad problems, is a very prosperous society in relative terms. We have, the poor in our country have a really bad situation in many respects because of the weaknesses in our social welfare system. But the middle class has a lot to lose, and from the idea of displacing the entire social order. And so it's not a revolutionary society. And so that's a fundamental problem for those who, make, I think one valid point in the argument from those who favor a more revolutionary outlook is that it is true that what is on offer through plausible incremental legislative change at this moment does not look like it's going to be sufficient to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That could change. We could have some technological breakthrough that really changes the game. But right now, it looks like we're going to go past that point, and then we're going to need to rely on some degree of removing carbon from the atmosphere, some degree of geoengineering to get it back below that. And that's a really hazardous place to be. And we don't know exactly where the tipping points that are going to kick off feedback cycles that accelerate the process are. They could be well past 1.5 degrees Celsius, but they could be even before that. And so it's a dangerous situation that we're in. And I understand why people are frustrated by the options that are on the table. My belief is just that if you want to create a politically sustainable coalition for minimizing climate change, that is going to involve making concessions to majoritarian opinion, which does not favor a revolutionary turn.
If we zoom out a little more, and again, I'll remind people that the title of the piece is Blaming Capitalism Is Not an Alternative to Solving Problems. It is very popular among the left to blame capitalism in a number of different ways for many of the problems that we're facing, even going beyond climate change. The idea of capitalism as the superstructure that has both enabled and even encouraged and incentivized the sorts of behaviors and industry and rent seeking, et cetera, that got us to where we are. And that since capitalism is the cause, it certainly isn't going to be the solution. I think that would be the view of some on this issue. Is your argument, to the extent that you're making one, that even if the blame is correct, it's not the right focus in terms of finding solutions? Or do you question whether the blame is actually correct?
It's going to depend on how we specify our terms and how we define capitalism and in what specific issues we're looking at. With regard to climate change, I think it's complicated. I think that one could make the argument that keeping warming within 1.5 degrees, that a precondition is to significantly more socialize and plan the economy than existing American capitalism allows for. At the same time, the idea, maybe that's a necessary condition, but I don't think that that's sufficient, because if we look at the environmental record of the Soviet Union, if we look at the non-capitalist economies that have existed, they have done tremendous carbon emissions as well and tremendous environmental damage. And this socialist writer Lee Phillips had a piece a while ago making the argument that if we had a global socialist system in the 20th century, that climate change would actually have been worse, because before the science became clear, we would have been wanting to spread the fruits of industrial modernity to everybody on the planet. So instead of just the West enjoying the massive increases in living standards that the fossil fuel economy made possible, in an ideal socialist utopian world, right, the people in sub-Saharan Africa would have also been enjoying the benefits in the mid 20th century of automobiles and television, electronics, and everything, and we would have had more emissions by the time in the 1970s when we got a really clear sense of the hazards. Now, his argument is that nonetheless, socialism is the cure because it can allow us to more rapidly switch out the energy basis of our society than a capitalist free market system would allow. But it's just a little bit more complicated than that, because ultimately climate change is a product of industrial modernity, and that is, we've had communist and capitalist versions of that, and both of them have created considerable emissions.
Much of what we've been talking about today is related to Eric's piece, Blaming Capitalism Is Not an Alternative to Solving Problems. We've been speaking with Eric Levitz, who writes about politics and economics for New York Magazine. Eric, really appreciate your time and insights today.
Yep, thanks for talking to me.